I would like to welcome all of you to our special lecture today, which is an endowed lectureship by Dr. Khodadad about greed. And we have a distinguished speaker from the Netherlands actually with us. He's 6 hours ahead of us, but he's ready to go. Um, so let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Khodadad in case you don't know him. He actually is a former neurosurgery faculty here at the University of Cincinnati who retired about 22 years ago after 30 years of service. He pioneered a surgical procedure to improve blood flow to the back of the brain, which is still being used today. As a boy growing up in Iran, he was fascinated by behavior after watching ants locked in battle until one of them is killed. This made him wonder about aggressive behavior. Next. He completed his medical school education in Iran and studied psychiatry at the University of Tehran School of Medicine. He wanted to become a researcher to study the mysteries of the human brain, but was convinced by the head of neurosurgery at University of Pennsylvania to go into neurosurgery, which he did. He went on to have a successful career as a neurosurgeon, and he developed a strong interest in pathological selfishness and greed, and donated $10 million to Tufts University to investigate the brain circuits that mediate selfishness in animals and humans. In 2021, he gave our department a donation to establish an annual Grand Round lecture with a focus on severe personality disorders. So now you know the background of the Khodadad lecture. I will now introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Marcel Zeelenberg, who is a professor of behavioral research and marketing at the Free University in Amsterdam. I'm saying free because it's listed in Dutch. And he's also professor of economic psychology at Tilburg University, Department of Social Psychology, and visiting professor at Leiden University, Department of Social and Organizational Psychology. He received his PhD in 1996 and is currently a professor of economic psychology at Tilburg University, as I mentioned. He studied cognitive psychology at Leiden University in the past and did a PhD in social psychology at the University of Amsterdam, culminating in 1996. Next, he held postdoc positions at Eindhoven University of Technology and Sussex University in the United Kingdom. And since 1998, he has worked at Tilburg University. He started as assistant professor of marketing and in 2000 was appointed professor of social psychology. Marcel conducts research on how people make choices and the role emotions and motivations play in this process. For example, he has published frequently on the psychology of regret, disappointment, guilt, shame, envy, anger, pride, and hope. And he's also done research on what greed is and how greed affects people's economic choices. Finally, he examines financial behaviors in the context of taxes, insurance, poverty, and gambling behavior. So you're in for a treat today about a topic you probably never heard a lecture about. I bet you that you will learn a lot of new things today. And Dr. Zeelenberg, I welcome you as our distinguished speaker today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Nasrallah. Let me start by sharing my screen. This should work like this. Then give me 1 second to find my screen here. Excellent. Well, it's a big honor for me to give this lecture on the other side of the ocean from the luxury of my own study here at Tilburg. And I'm very excited to talk to you about the psychology of greed in this lecture. Hearing sort of the introduction and all the negative emotions that I've been studying, and you could see greed as a negative emotion or a negative personality trait as well. I don't hope you get the impression that you get a grumpy guy talking about bad things in life. On the contrary, I think I actually enjoy life, but I also enjoy sort of examining how people basically behave, why people behave in a certain way, and what the role of emotions and motivations are. So I studied psychology in Leiden, did the PhD in Amsterdam, and now I've been in Tilburg for 26 years. I'm probably one of the most loyal employees. I hope to make it until retirement here. What will I talk to you about today? I'll talk about recent developments in the psychology of greed. We have been studying greed for, I would say, about 15 years now, and I think we have learned quite a lot. So I'm going to share some of the things that we learned, some of the things that we ran into over the years. Let me say a few things. So I work at Tilburg University and the Free University of Amsterdam. I'm a professor of psychology and a professor of marketing. I don't know that much about marketing, but I think I know quite a bit about consumer behavior, and marketers are also interested in that. Now you also see here on the slide a money tree, and because we don't have those, at least I don't have it, and most people don't have those trees in their garden, we have to make wise decisions with our money. And I'm an economic psychologist, so this is one of the things that we study. And when I say we, I also mean the people here in Tilburg that I collaborate with. And some of us are organized in TIBER, the Tilburg Institute for Behavioral Economics Research. It could have been called the Tilburg Institute for Economic Psychological Research, but somehow, if you refer to yourself as a behavioral economist, people think that what you tell is more relevant. Now, I luckily work with economists, marketing researchers, and psychologists, so I can basically benefit from all their knowledge. Now, let me start with disclosing that I have no relationships to disclose here and no disclosures to report. The research that I do is basically paid by the Dutch taxpayer. The university basically finances all my research, so there's no other parties involved. And I sometimes have like research grants, but these are then either from the university or from the Dutch Science Foundation. So what you get here is as far as anybody can be really unbiased, but an unbiased view on the psychology of greed, informing you about what greed is, how greed can be assessed, and what greed actually does. Now, there's a few learning objectives in this lecture. There's a few things that I hope you'll be able to pick up from it. I'll talk a lot about greed. So the idea is that you will be able to recognize instances of greed in yourself. You'll be able to recognize instances of greed in others. And you also will develop some understanding and be able to assess greediness with the dispositional greed scale that we developed. So I'll talk more about that scale later, but it's basically a 7-item questionnaire, and that validly and reliably assesses how greedy people are. Now, most people, when I talk about greed, know very little about it, but they know Gordon Gekko, who basically was modeled after partly after Ivan Boesky, an investment banker, I think, who actually died last week. And this greed is good, greed, for lack of a better word, is good, is a part of a speech that Gordon Gekko gave at Berkeley, where he basically said you can still be greedy and feel good about yourself. So he basically, as a banker, told that greed was good, and this was in a time before the financial crisis that people actually thought that greed could have these potential beneficial aspects. Now, there's more people that you could say that greed is good. This is your former President Bush with a book of the picture that you also saw at the beginning of this talk. With I think it's called in English the Very Hungry Caterpillar. The Dutch name is Rupsje nooit genoeg, the caterpillar who never has enough. So it's basically a very greedy caterpillar. And well, President Bush tells here about the greedy behavior of this caterpillar, and maybe telling people the potential benefits of greed, just like Ivan Boesky did. If you start thinking about greed and what greed is, and I come to more formal definitions later, you also see instances everywhere around you. I would say that those buffet dinner places are such a celebration of greed where people scoop up so much food that they cannot even eat it and everything goes to waste. This is one of the things that, the bad sides of greed. Yeah, you can't see it here, but I have some greedy elements in myself as well, and I think one of the things that I want you to understand from this lecture is that it's not that people are greedy or not greedy, but greed is like a dimension, and you can be more or less greedy. And most of us have some greedy elements in us. I love books. I buy a lot of books, and I buy so many new books that sometimes I think I don't need to buy new books for a long time because I will just read the books that I have, and then I go to the center of town, I go to the bookstore, and of course I end up buying more books. That is good for the economy, you could say, and good for me because I read a lot. Greed has a very negative connotation, because if you buy more books than you can read, if you buy more clothes than you can wear, if you buy more stuff than you need, you basically engage in overconsumption, and this has all sorts of negative benefits. It's bad for your financial position, and it also doesn't really make people happy. Might also make you fat if you consume too much. And this is one of the things I have not yet studied, but it's one of the things that actually is very simple to study if there is a correlation between being greedy and maybe people's BMI. Now, greed has been also associated with environmentally bad behavior because, I think it's a statement from Gandhi, there is enough in the world for a man's need, but not for a man's greed. And we are basically eating up our world for the next generations. Global warming is a thing, and I think we notice that all the time, and it's very much related to us consuming more than we actually need. Now, we started studying greed, as I said, about 15 years ago, and the reason that we started, I have a picture of her later, is that a student of mine, undergraduate student, came to me and said, I want to do my thesis with you, and I want to study greed. And I told her, I said, that sounds like a really interesting and relevant topic. I don't know anything about it, so you should dive into the literature and find what is done. And she comes back a few days later and said, there's nothing there. And I didn't believe it. I thought, no, what do you mean there's nothing there? I said, well, I can find some papers on greed, but I can't really find empirical research. And I said, yeah, it seems impossible. As you know, I knew that in economics, there's lots of talk about greed, and there must be some empirical research. So I said, come sit next to me and I'll show you how you do your literature research. That was the arrogant me speaking, thinking that I knew better. So we sat down on my computer and I started Googling, and I found, hey, here's an interesting paper about greed. He said, yeah, I read it. It's only conceptual. There's no data in it. Okay, I said, here's another one. He said, yeah, they say that it's about greed. It's basically only about selfishness, but not necessarily about greed. And so we went through like 10 articles, and it turned out that she had read all of them, and she was right. There was hardly any work done on greed, and there was some talk about it, but very little research. And I immediately realized that, man, this is a potential gold mine for us. If we dive into this in this gap, we can study all those really interesting and cool things. So we started thinking, we started brainstorming, and we started looking for insights in greediness. And actually, it turned out that some of the examples, the negative examples of greed, could be found in my own university. So this is actually the man that hired me as a professor of psychology in 2000. He was the dean of our school, and he was prosecuted recently for having committed basically embezzling, I think, like 2 or 3 million euros from the university, and basically showing very clearly bad greedy behavior. Another example that some of you might know is Diederik Stapel, a Dutch social psychologist. He used to be my best friend, lives around the corner here. and he was caught in, well, I think also about like 11, 12 years ago for basically conducting research fraud. And although I cannot really attest to why he did it, I think one of the clear reasons was that the funds he acquired for himself, the salary that he got, the benefits that he got, were of course way better by committing fraud. So I think greed also is a clear element in there, or at least a clear example of what greed could lead to. Now, this is me before the beard with Terry Seuntjens, the students who started to who basically put us on the track of studying greed. And also the first articles we published were all first authored by Terry. And here's a picture of us with her dissertation. On the day that it arrived in the Netherlands, dissertations are always printed as a book. And so this arrived, and I said, you know what we do? We'll make a picture and we put it on Facebook. That'll be fun. So I put it on Facebook, and half an hour later, she comes running to my office. She said, we already have like 50 likes. I said, what are you talking about? She said, the picture on Facebook. I had already forgotten it, but and then half an hour later, she said, we already have 100 likes. I want to have 200 likes. And so she turned out to be like really greedy for attention on Facebook. And I think that demonstrates something that it's important to realize. Greed does not only it's not only about money or about stuff, but can also be about non-material things, non-tangible things, such as attention, such as power, such as sex, such as influence. So you can be greedy about anything that is actually appreciated. Now, we started reading the literature and finding out, or trying to find out, what can we study if we're interested in greed. And the reason that Terry actually became interested is this was shortly after the financial crisis. And there, of course, many people blamed bankers for greedy behavior causing this financial crisis. This was also the reason how she came to be interested in it. And I cannot say that the crisis was caused by greed, but of course, we all know that bankers or rich people tend to be a little bit greedier than people in other professions. There's actually some data about that we might talk about later. Now, we started to think about what is greed and how can we find it. And while we were brainstorming, we found a number of stories or fables that actually related to greed. So here is the goose with the golden eggs. You might know the story where a farmer in the morning finds like an egg under the goose, and it's like very heavy, and he cleans it, and it's a golden egg. And then, you know, a day later there's again a golden egg, and the day later there's again a golden egg. And here there are different versions of the story, but in one version, I think the most popular version, the farmer's wife actually turns greedy and says we have to slaughter the goose and get all the gold out of it at once. And then they do that, and they cut the animal open, and they find there's no gold in it, and they have slaughtered the goose with the golden eggs. So what you see there is basically in those stories, greed is portrayed as something that is bad and that has negative results for the person that is greedy. So King Midas is another one. King Midas, according to the story, did something for some fable figure, and he was granted a wish, and he said that he wished that everything he would touch would turn into gold. And then the wish was granted, and indeed everything he touched turned into gold, and he was very excited about it up to the moment that he wanted to eat, because then he touched his food and his food turned into gold, so he couldn't eat anymore. So he had to sit down, and people actually had to feed him, which is not very pleasant if that is something that, you know, has to be done each time. And there's also different endings of this story. In some endings, he actually ends up touching his daughter, and his daughter actually turns into gold. So he killed his own daughter by his greediness. Now we also see here Mr. Krabs from SpongeBob, who's being greedy, Scrooge McDuck, who's a well-known greedy person, and Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street. So what you see in all the stories is that greedy people are not liked and typically not liked by anybody, and often it ends badly for them. Here's another example of greedy behavior. This is a clip from, I think, Black Friday. Some cultural manifestation from the US that we have actually imported into the Netherlands. So we do that now as well. And we also see people go into stores, well, less and less nowadays because this now also takes place online. But the events like this sort of bring, I would say, bring out the worst in people. And theoretically, it's, I think, very interesting because often in these cases, there is a mixture of scarcity and abundance that really triggers greed in people. So they see lots of stuff they want to have, but they also see many people that want it, and then you get some sort of like competition for it, and this fuels the greediness in people. So these were things that we thought about. This is when I was sort of speculating with Terry Saunders about what greed was. She thought about eating chocolates, and she told me if I would not end up in academia, this would be my career. Well, she, in the meantime, left academia. She's now a well-paid data scientist, but she still has a very sweet tooth and loves chocolate a lot. So this again shows that greed can also be about non-materialistic things. Now here's a clip that I really like. You see the chimpanzee, after they have distributed the food, taking so many oranges with him, even between his toes, that he has way more than he can actually eat. And I think the moment I see some sort of behavior in animals that I also see in people, I think, you know, this is an indication that this is really an interesting thing to study. Now, greed stereotypically is about wishing that you had more money. And what's interesting from this cartoon is that you see the rich man wishing that he had more money, but also the poor man thinks the same thing. So irrespective of what you have, you can still be greedy about more. But not only about money, but also about, for example, likes on social media. Like Terry, my colleague Terry, who was very greedy of the likes of her picture on the Facebook. You see here also somebody who get like only 4 likes is greedy for more. But also somebody who got like 13,000 likes is greedy for more. So it doesn't really matter how much you have. You can still be greedy about getting more of what you like. Now, of course, Terry and I did not only think about and read about fables. We also dove into the academic literature. And very soon we found this article from the Academy of Management Annals by Long Wang and Keith Murnaghan. And the article is called On Greed, and it's actually a summary, or how I should say, it's a review of various literatures from history, philosophy, economics, politics, psychology, and religion about what people have thought about, conceptualized, theorized about what greed is. And one of the conclusions that they draw is, they say, empirical research on the personal and social dynamics of greed is rare. One reason for this lack of research may start with the enormous difficulty that surrounds the seemingly simple task of defining greed. So they review all the ideas about greed that are out there in the literature, and they basically say, yeah, it's all ideas. There's no research because people really don't know what greed is. People have a hard time finding out what it is. This turned out to be our first task. And you know, what is greed? Can we find out what greed is? And the first article we published, so this is together with Terry Saunders, Niels van der Ven, Sego Breugelmans, and myself. I read out those names because I know how difficult they are to pronounce for people who aren't Dutch. The first article we did is called Defining Greed. We took up the challenge that Wang and Murnaghan provided. You know, can we come up to can we provide the definition of what greed is? So what we did is we did what is called a prototype analysis. And a prototype analysis is a way to find out what people talk about when they talk about a certain concept, and then come up to like a definition of it. So in the first study, we asked people to generate all the things that came up in their mind when they thought about greed. And then in the second study, we asked other participants to rate on rating scales how stereotypical or prototypical this elements were for greediness. And then in the third study, we asked people to recall an own instance of greed, and we asked them to rate that on the dimensions that we got from the previous studies. And so in the end, we got like a whole set of features, important features that are central to what greed is. Now, you need a prototype analysis, especially for things where it's hard to come up with a good definition. And the definition that we came up with is greed is the dissatisfaction of not having enough and always wanting more. And then we found later on this Dilbert, if you always want more, you can never be happy what you have. And that is basically what it boils down to. That is what greed is. And you could say, well, do you need to study that? Isn't that, very simple? Can't you just use the dictionary to find your definition? Well, there are some discussions in what greed actually is and what elements are important in greed that maybe show the difficulty. So here's another paper published in 2020 in the journal Organizational Behavior and Human Decision Processes. And there they talk about the role of harm to others in greed. And if you read about greed and if you talk to people about greed, it's often part of people's definition that greed leads to harm to others, or something is greedy if it harms others. And we think we find it weird to define a concept in terms of its consequences. So we think behavior is greedy and can lead to harm to others, of course. But if accidentally others are not harmed, the behavior can still be very greedy. It can still be motivated by the greediness of the person. And this cartoon of actually a cartoonist from Tilburg, my hometown, do you really want to hurt me? Yes. Well, that's a weird answer, And our point is, greedy people might end up hurting others by their greedy behavior, but not because they like it, but just because they don't care about it. They care only about their own outcomes and their own acquisitions. And if that leads to hurting others, so be it. And if it leads to benefiting others, that is also fine. So greedy people care mostly for themselves. Now, we found out what greed is, and then we also thought, can we maybe assess how greedy people are? Because from the moment that we started thinking about, hey, what is actually greed, and do we see it in people's behavior, most people can easily come up with examples of people that are really greedy or people that are not greedy at all. So you might have a colleague that whenever there is like a buffet dinner, is always first in line, or another colleague that always complains about earning too little income. But you also have people that don't mind waiting for their turn, don't complain about the income, and just seem to be happy whatever they have. So there seem to be very clear differences in how greedy people were. And with our first paper, where we examined what actually is greed, it's this insatiable desire for more, and being dissatisfied with your current situation, then we thought, can we maybe develop a scale to assess how greedy people are? And this was our second project that we published in the same year, 2015, in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, basically the flagship journal of the social psychologist, published by the American Psychological Association. And what we did in this article is we, based on the prototype analysis that we had, we generated about 20 statements that we thought were about being greedy. And we gave them to a group of participants, had them rate it, did factor analysis, and looked at which of these items do we actually need to measure what greed is. And we could reduce the 20 items to those 7. And these are the 7 items that form our dispositional greed scale. I always want more. So we asked people, here are 7 statements that may or may not describe you. Please indicate to what extent you agree with those statements. I always want more. Actually, I'm kind of greedy. One can never have too much money. As soon as I have acquired something, I start to think about the next thing I want. It doesn't matter how much I have. I'm never completely satisfied. Number 6 is my favorite one. My life motto is more is better. And 7, I can't imagine having too many things. Now, these were the items that ended up as our greed scale. And virtually all the research that we have been doing afterwards use this scale to measure individual differences in greediness. So some people score high on this on the scale, other people score low on the scale, and the average is typically between 2.5 and 3. And there, of course, when I look at the items now, there are some items. There's one item in there that I would not put in there anymore if I would do the research again. That is, one can never have too much money, because that basically makes money a central element in this scale, and I don't think that is needed. But anyhow, this is the scale that we ended up with. We published, what was it, 2022, Seger Breugelmans and I, a review article where we summarized what we knew at that time about greed. And there we also had data from another study. So this is like 1,300 Americans from the Amazon Mechanical Turk website. This is a web panel. And so the scale goes from 1 to 5. This is the average score that people have. And then we see that here the average is about 2.5. Standard deviation is 0.88. So most people are sort of in the middle on the greediness, and some people are on the high end, and some people are on the low end. And that means that there is a nice spread in the greediness of people. And what is interesting is that when we developed this scale, so the scale was published in 2015, we ran this of course before, and we had a big sample when we were doing that research in 2013, which was a representative sample of the Dutch population with more than 5,000 people in a big panel here that is organized by Tilburg University. And in 2019, so but this is 6 years later, we did another big sample in that panel, and of course, some people drop out of the panel. There's some new people. So the sample in 2019 was about 2,367, and we found that we had about 1,500 people who took place in both studies. And then we could compute the retest reliability, and we found there was a correlation of 0.6 between the greed score in 2013 and 2019. And that's a really sizable correlation, and that shows that this is a pretty stable trait that people have. So we had like retest reliability in other studies before, but only with a few months in between, but this one has 6 years in between, and we find like a correlation of 0.6. So that is really nice, and it says something about that this is like really an essential part, or let's say this is a stable part of people's personality. It's not essential. There are more important things in people's life, but it is pretty stable. Now, what then happened, and that is something that made me very proud as a researcher, is that very quickly after we published this scale, people found the scale and started to work with it and translate it and validate it for usage in other languages. And that is always really nice, of course. It also, I think, shows that there was actually quite some interest in what greed is among people, and there was not yet a very proper way of measuring it. So there was already in 2018 a Japanese translation published. I don't read Japanese, but they luckily also have the English title, Development of the Japanese Version of the Disposition of Greed Scale. In 2019, there was a Chinese version, and that was also validated in big samples. So they translated and they validated. Then in 2000, what was this? I think also 2019, there was also 2019 translation in Brazilian Portuguese published, and last year we published a Spanish translation ourselves. So I speak a little bit of Spanish. I've taken Spanish classes for like 6 years. Seger Breugelmans, my colleague, lived in Mexico for a year when he did his PhD, studying emotions in the Rarámuri Indians. But of course, the real Spanish speaking person is Catalina Estrada Mejia, who was in the School of Management at the University of the Los Andes in Bogota, Colombia. And we happen to know Catalina because she did a PhD with me about 10 years ago. And then we thought, well, let's try if we can also make a Spanish translation. So we did a Spanish translation, and that also worked really well. And I know there are also translations in Russian, in White Russian, in German. So there's various translations available now of this scale. Now, that is nice. We were super happy that people found their way to our scales, but what is actually I think quite interesting, we published our scale in 2015 because there was no research on greed, and it turns out that there were two Belgian researchers that are, I think, about this is 150 kilometers away from here, just across the border in Belgium, like a 1.5 hour car ride, that actually did precisely the same as we did. So they also published a paper in 2015 called Dispositional Greed, same name as ours. And they also had a scale that they referred to as the Dispositional Greed scale, same name as our scale. And if you look at the items of the scale, you see, no matter how much I have of something, I always want more. One can never have enough. Even when I'm fulfilled, I often seek more. The pursuit of more and better is an important goal in life. And then they also have two reverse coded that so basically measure the opposite. And this was, super coincidental. When this paper came out, I already knew that this was going to come out because Mario Pandelare contacted me because he heard from a colleague that we were working on greed, and he was doing that as well. And we were both already like in the process of publishing. And then it turns out that we have two of the same scales. What was funny is that there was, so this is a Dutch clipping of a newspaper where there was a journalist and then wrote, so the translation is, all of a sudden you can measure greed twice. And that journalist says, this is weird. There's, two teams of people studying greed, and we get two different scales, and, is this not a waste of money? I was actually very happy that it happened because we just had this big reproducibility crisis in psychology that many studies didn't replicate. And now what we have is actually a really, I would say, even an ideal version that you have two teams, two teams that independently think, hey, it's interesting to develop a greed scale. And they go on doing that, and they do it in their own different ways. And then both of them come up with a scale that actually look very similar. And I think that is, if you talk about reproducibility, if you talk about replication, if you talk about reliability of research, I think the fact that we have those two scales makes it really interesting. Now, we're not there yet. What happened is that there actually were other scales. So this one is also published in 2015 by Patrick Mussel, a German researcher. And then in 2016, he published the second one that sort of overlapped half with it. So there's two other scales. And then it turned out that in 2014, so a year before our paper came out, there was also a greed scale in this paper, The Dark Triad and the Seven Deadly Sins. We missed this publication completely. And the reason is that the word greed is not part of the title, and the word greed is not part of the abstract. And also there's no items published in this scale. So we only found out about this scale when it was already published. Now, then you are in a situation that all of a sudden there are 5 different scales to assess the greediness of people. And then you can wonder, ask yourself, what do we do with this? Are these good scales? Do they measure the same thing or different things? And both the team of Patrick Mussel and we ourselves did extensive comparisons of those scales. And basically what we found is that all those scales measure the same thing. So so what we did, we had like 1,000 people fill in all the different scales and then compute correlations between the scales, and the correlations were like 0.9 and higher. So all those scales, even though the wording of the items is slightly different, even though the definitions that are used. So, for example, Patrick Mussel has in his definition that greed happens at the expense of others, or even happens at the expense of others. Still, those scales all correlate really, really highly. Now, I think that is very good news. That is good news that these scales actually measure something, and that it shows the validity of these measurements. And it also shows that you could actually take any of those scales if you want to measure greed and study it. For some reason, ours is the only one that has published translations. So that is actually going very well. So if you ask me, of course, I would say use our scale. But if you ask me to be honest, and I try to be honest, any scale, any greed scale will do. They're all very good scales. It turns out that even last year and 2 years ago, this paper was published about, again, another scale. And this paper is still in press, and that is about domain-specific greed, where they say, well, most greed scales are just about greed as a trait, but maybe people are greedy in different domains. One person is greedy for one thing, another person is greedy for another thing. So they basically developed a scale where you measure domain-specific greed. But again, it's a measurement of greed with self-report. So as an interim summary, dispositional greed can be reliably assessed via the DGS, dispositional greed scale. There are other greed scales. All these scales also assess greediness, also reliably. And the fact that they all converge is actually good news. It's good news about the reproducibility of science, but also good news about building theories about greed and having insights in greed, because this is how greed works. The scale is free, available for anybody. Anybody can use it. All the items are in the publication, and if you want to use it, go for it. Now, how is greed distinct? I'm going to speed up a little bit because I have many more things to say, and I notice when I get enthusiastic, I sometimes go too slow, sometimes go too quick. One of the things we wanted to do when we developed our scale is we thought, well, is this something else than other concepts? And there's a few other concepts that we think are relevant. So one of the things is maximization. Barry Schwartz published a nice scale about it. There is also self-interestedness, what we also refer to as social value orientation. There is envy. Some people are envious, which is also related to greed. And some people also are materialistic, and that is also related to greed. So what we did in various studies, sometimes with like 167 students, 236 students, 345 Americans via MTurk, and the sample with more than 5,000 Dutch people, we basically let people fill in the scales and different scales and relate them to each other, and we look how different they are. And what we then find is that yes, indeed, greed relates to a number of those other traits, which shows that these constructs are related, but the correlations are not very high. They're like in the range between 0.2, 0.3. And the only thing where the correlations are substantially higher is for materialism. So if you measure materialism, you find that greed and materialism actually correlate highly. And that could be theoretically a problem because, then you should be able to explain how greed is different from materialism. So what we did when we found that out, we had another close look at the material value scale that we used, and we find that those items actually used in that scale very often not only measure materialism, but also measure things like status seeking and things like greed. So we did a study to find out if these are different. So we had about 300 participants, and we measured how greedy they were with our greed scale. We measured how materialistic they are with the material value scale. And we gave them 4 questions. And one of those questions is about a material thing, and the other 3 are about other things that you would like to acquire maybe, but these are not necessarily materialistic. So when I'm eating a bag of chips, I don't want to stop until the bag is finished. Correlates with greed, not with materialism. When I'm single, I like to have casual sex with as many people as possible. Correlates with greed and to a lesser extent with materialism. When I use social networking sites such as Facebook and LinkedIn, I want to have as many friends as possible. Correlates with greed and with materialism. And when I see a newer model of my phone, I immediately want to have it. Correlates with greed and also with materialism. And this is the only materialistic version. Now, we then did partial correlations, where we partialed out the variance explained by the other constructs, and then you see that greed correlates with the other three, and materialism only correlates with the materialistic value. And this clearly shows that greed is something else than materialism. Now, another thing that we wanted to show is that, hey, how is greed actually different from self-interest? You know, these things, and the name giver of this lecture series was also interested in greed and self-interest, and these things are often seen as very similar, but we wanted to find out, are they also different? You know, both greed and self-interest are very important motives. Sometimes greed is seen as extreme and immoral self-interest. Self-interest is mentioned as a feature of greed in the prototype analysis that we did. And it's also likely that people that are greedy, that they are self-interested because they want more for themselves. So what we did in another study with Carlijn Hoyer, another PhD student that was supervised by Zegel Breugelmans and myself, we read this article by Erickson and colleagues, where they basically say, hey, selfish people, according to the theories, the theories about selfishness in economics and biology, should be more successful. So they should have more money and more children, because that is what success is about in biology and economics. And actually, they found the opposite. And we thought, well, let's see if we can also study that for greed, and then look at economic success, money, evolutionary success, children, and psychological success, whether people are happy or not. And what we did is we measured greed, and we had two different ways of measuring self-interest, the same way as the Erickson with pro-social motivation, or the more traditional social value orientation manner. And what we found is that if you look at personal income, you don't find anything for personal income, but we do find that greed is related to household income and social value orientation also, but we could not replicate the findings of Erickson. If you then look at children, we see that the social value orientation has no substantial relations with the number of children. Pro-social motivation has some relation, but not very strong. But with greed, these are much stronger. So the greedier people are, the less children they have. The shorter their relationships are, but the more sexual partners they have. So greedy people are also greedy in this domain. And we also looked at life satisfaction, and we clearly found that greedy people are less happy with life. We don't find anything for the pro-social motivation measure. We find a small effect for the social value orientation measure. And so this research shows that greed is really distinct from those different measures for self-interest and predicts different effects. And the effects that we find do not show that being greedy makes you richer. It doesn't give you stable relationships. It doesn't make you happy. It only gives you more sex partners. So maybe that is what they're greedy about, but even that doesn't make them happy. Now, what is greed? Greed is the insatiable desire for more. It can be measured, as I explained, in a reliable and valid way. And greed, materialism, self-interest, and envy are separate but related phenomena. So they are related, but they are different, and they have their own effects. And then you may wonder, so what are these effects? You know, if you can measure greed, we know what it is, and we can reliably and validly measure it. Do we know what the effects are? What does greed do? You know? And so this is what greed does. One of the things we studied very quickly after we developed the scale, we had the opportunity to include our scale, but not all the items, only 3. So we selected 3 items based on statistical analysis. I always want more. Actually, I'm kind of greedy. And as soon as I have acquired something, I start to think about the next thing I want. Those 3 we could enter in a big survey that the NIBUD, which is the Dutch organization for family financial advice, they often do big studies, and they allowed us to put in the greed scale. And this was a study with adolescents, so high school students. And what we found here is that, I have the results here, greed predicted income per month. So they got more. Income is a combination of their pocket money, but also the jobs that they have, the high school students. So they generate more income, they spend more money, they save less, and they actually have more debts. Now, in the Netherlands, if you're an adolescent, if you're below 18, you cannot have official debts, but you can, of course, have debts with your friends or your parents. And this study I thought was really interesting because it has the positive aspect of greed, that it generates more income. Greedy people work harder, or at least manage to get more money, and also the negative sides that they spend more, save less, and are more in debt. And we find that in one study. We have another paper that we published in 2019 called Greedy Bastards. And here we were interested in the ideas that greed is an immoral trait, that it's a dark trait, and that it has these negative aspects. So what we did is we did a whole number of studies, and where we basically asked people, imagine you go to a shop and you pay with $20 and they give you back as if you paid with $50. Do you tell them? Or what do you think about illegally downloading music? Or what do you think about cheating on your taxes? Or how acceptable is it to tell a little white lie? Or how acceptable is it if you are in a committed relationship to have sex with somebody else? Now, we did that in a number of samples, in a number of studies with over like 3,000 people, and we found a correlation there that the greedier people are, the more likely they at least tell themselves that they engage in those behaviors, and also the less problematic that they find those behaviors. So there is a clear indication that greedy people have a different morality than non-greedy people, or the greedier people are, the more flexible they are with their morality. Now, I said before in the other study that we found that greedy adolescents generate a little bit more income. At that time, also this paper came out by Chris Shee and colleagues, where they study something and that they refer to as over-earning. And basically what they say is that, hey, what happens in life is people chase money. You know, their whole life they chase money and they acquire money. And then in the end of life, they have all the money and then they die. And they say that is not very wise, because you earned all that money, but you cannot do anything with it, and you forwent all these nice things where you could actually enjoy free time, but you work too hard. This is not very efficient, and this is not very efficient, and they thought, can we develop a paradigm to study this in the lab? And they developed a really interesting paradigm where people come to the lab and they listen to, they get headphones on, they hear nice music, and this is a proxy for enjoying leisure time. But they can also push a button on the keyboard of the computer where they're sitting behind, and then the music gets interrupted by white noise. Not very nice, but if you push the button 20 times, you get a chocolate. So you work, which is not nice, and you get income, which are chocolates. And then they can do this for 5 minutes, and then they tell them before, after that you get 5 minutes where you can eat the chocolates, but all the chocolates that you don't eat, you cannot take home, you have to give them back to us afterwards. And then they say, this is a proxy for work, and they find that people actually generate more chocolates than that they eat. So they over-earn also in this task. And I thought, yeah, this is interesting, but this also sounds to me not like just over-earning, but also a manifestation of greed. So what we did is we replicated that, and we found that, so this is, here we have a scale where we plot people's disposition of greed. Here we have the number of chocolates, and this is the number of chocolates earned. This the first line. This is the number of chocolates consumed. And this is, this is the solid line, is the number of chocolates consumed. And this dotted line is the number of chocolates over-earned. And what you see is that the greedier people are, the harder they work, the more chocolates they have, but they don't really eat more. So they also have to give back more. They also work for nothing. And we have questions also about regret there, and they also regret doing that. But if you let them come back in the lab 3 weeks later, they basically show the same behavior. So they don't really learn from that. So if they do the same task later on, you find basically the same effects. That really people work harder, but also work hard if they cannot enjoy the benefits, the fruit of their workings. So that was, I would say, a really nice behavioral measure, a behavioral validation of our greed scale. Now, I told you in the beginning that we started doing this research because we thought that greed might have been related to the behavior of bankers. And then we thought, well, if that would be the case, and if that would have played a role in the financial crisis, then we should also find effects of this dispositional greed that we study on trading behavior if you put people in experimental markets. And for this, this is part of Carlijn Hoyer's dissertation, and we collaborate with Steven Zeisberger, a finance professor from Nijmegen, a city in the Netherlands. And we did a number of studies where we put people in actual market situations where they can buy shares and sell shares and actually earn money with it. And we assessed their greediness, and we could not find any effect for greed having an effect on the trading behavior. So this is what we did first. And then we thought, it's really weird. Luckily, we could still publish these findings, even though it was basically a null finding. But then we realized, well, maybe it is the case that in real markets, like the stock markets, there is some sort of selection of greedy people that enter those markets. And then you have a bunch of greedy people trading together, and they might actually create a situation that we have not found in this first paper. So in the second paper, we first assessed people's greediness, and then we put like non-greedy people together, and we put greedy people together, and then we let them play again in markets. And then we thought, now we will find that greedy people are worse traders and create more bubbles in the market. So this is the markets here. Are the bubbles that you can talk about, that the value of the stuff that they trade doesn't correspond anymore to the actual value. And what we found in this, well, basically we didn't really find anything again in this research. But if we found something, we actually found that greedy people were better traders than non-greedy people. And so we're still puzzled about what is actually going on here. But I like the fact that we nowadays also can publish results that are not very clear and that might not be very strong, but this might still help us further to understand what greed is and what greed does. So we found quite some effects of greed in all sorts of studies, but not in this complex market behaviors. Now, one of the things, and I think that this is the last research that I will talk to you about in this presentation. This is again research with Carlijn Hoyer. We had been studying greed mostly in economic type contexts. So we have done like negotiation games and other sort of games where actually people could win or lose money. And we found some effects of greed. But in this particular research, we were interested in how does people's greediness actually influence their social relationships? Because we know that people don't like to be called greedy, and if you call somebody greedy, they don't like that. So what happens with greedy people in social relationships? Do we find some effects there as well? And we thought this was especially interesting because relationships, different than most economic situations, require mutual selection. So if you can be greedy and want to have more friends, and we also found in one of the first studies that greedy people indicate that they would like to have more friends on social media, but friendship in real life, you can be interested in more friends, but of course the other person also needs to like you. So will that happen, especially if greedy people are not so nice, maybe? And so relationships require mutual selection, but also repeated selection and interaction. So you meet somebody, you become acquainted, you might become friends, and if it goes wrong, the relationship might end. So we studied that here, and we were interested in. So this paper is called "Friends as Tools" because we were suspecting that greedy people actually treat other people more instrumental than non-greedy people. That they think a friend is somebody that you can benefit from, and so that is what we studied. And these were the assumptions that we had, the things that we wanted to examine. We thought greedy people might not be the nicest people. Greed is perceived as a negative trait. It's linked to immorality and unethical behaviors. We know that. From other research, we know that people that score high on greed score low on agreeableness, so they're not nice people, and they also score higher on meanness. So they can be mean people. We also thought greedy people might desire functional relationships, so that are beneficial for them, not necessarily a friend, but somebody that can help them when they need it. So they find somebody that can fulfill their needs without requiring too much in return. We did a study here with 4 samples, 2 samples from the list panel, the panel here in the university. That's a representative Dutch sample. We had in 2013 between 2,300 and 5,000, and in 2000 between like around 2,000. We have different samples. We have a student sample that we pre-registered, and we have a sample via Academic Prolific, a big online sample, and we measured and we found that greed is associated with feelings of loneliness. So greedy people feel more lonely. Greedy people objectify their friends more than non-greedy people. Greedy people also express that they want functional relationships. That's what they're actually after. And we find there that greedy people indicate that they have had a larger number of sexual partners. We also found negative relationships. We find that greedy people have a smaller number of close friends. So they might have or want more friends, but they have less close friends. And they also don't find a reliable alliance an important aspect of being a friend. Their relationships, their longest romantic relationship was longer, the greedier they are. And greedy people are less satisfied with social contacts. So we find in this study that greedy people have difficulties with relationships, and we don't know, of course, if this comes because the greedy people are easier bored of or they dump their friends when they're not functional anymore, or of course that the other person in the relationship finds out that their friend is not interested in them, but only in their car or in the tools or in whatever, and that they then enter a relationship. That is something that we're still looking after. Now, what have we found? Greedy people consider the friendship as means to an end. They feel more lonely, are less satisfied, and less close with their social relationships. They're more likely to have more sex partners, but those encounters do not seem to result in long-term romantic relationships. Now, this work on greed is ongoing research. We started about 15 years ago exploring this, and it has been, at least for me, a very sort of satisfying journey, and we're still working on all sorts of other projects. It's sort of spreading out all over the place. We are currently working on research on writing of papers, examining how greed relates to risk-taking. We examine the role of counterfactual thinking. So if only I had done that, what would have happened? How that plays a role in experience of greed. This is again risk-taking, so that is double. I have here, we have examined the role of greed in problem gambling with a big sample from the Netherlands, but also a sample from the UK. We're currently also engaged in finding out whether greedy people show less tax compliance, and that's a complicated study, so I cannot easily summarize that. And we're working on more research to disentangle greed from maximization and see where and how this leads to different behaviors. So that is stuff that we're currently working on, that we're busy with. The conclusion for today is greed is the insatiable desire for more. It's distinct, it's different than a number of other motivations that are relevant. It can be assessed reliably and validly with the DGS, the dispositional greed scale. We found in various studies that dispositional greed that you can assess with the scale is associated with greedy behavior. So greedy people actually also behave in a greedy way, more immoral, they work harder, they are less nice in friendships. And we're currently also investigating and thinking about what can we do to maybe prevent the negative consequences of greed in relationships. So that is one of the goals that we're currently focusing on. These are the people that I have worked most closely with in this research. So that is Terry Smeetjes, Carlijn Hooyer, Niels van der Ven, and Seger Breugelmans. I thank you for your attention, and if you have questions, I'm more than willing to answer them.
Thank you very much, Professor Zeelenberg, for an enlightening presentation about greed, which we've never heard before in our CME series. We're going to open the floor now for some questions and answers, and also some who might want to ask you verbally. They're encouraged to do so. Um, let's see. Here's the first question regarding the chocolate white noise study. I wonder if the earnings itself, more than the consuming, is the reward for the greedier people. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that is an excellent comment. So what I think is happening there, greedy people like to acquire stuff. They like to get stuff, and that is what is basically motivating them. So for the greedy people, the acquiring the chocolates is the reward more than the eating. That is correct. But what is interesting, I think, at least what I find interesting, is that if we ask them afterwards if they are satisfied with the chocolates and how much they worked for it, they actually also indicate that they're not satisfied, that they indicate that they felt that they worked too hard. So I think they're motivated by acquiring those chocolates as much as possible. I think it's some sort of competition with themselves, maybe as well, but it's not something that makes them happy in the end. So and I think if you think about people working really hard and during their whole life, there's also some research now that suggests that at the end of life, when people have worked their life really hard and they look back at their life, that you actually think, I've worked too hard and I should have spent more time with my loved ones, or should have been busier in sort of keeping in contact with my friends. So yes, I see that greedy people care about acquiring, but it's not something that makes them happy in the end. So very good question.
Here's a next question. I'd be curious about the element of boredom in the study. If they accounted for if there were other tasks to do during time or pro-social, if possible, that they thought they researchers would get the extra. I mean, I can't understand the
Yeah.
question.
No, but I understand the question. It's again a really interesting question. No, we did not. In this study, they basically could either listen to the music or push the button and interrupt the music and earn the chocolates. It could, of course, be the case that boredom played a role, but then it would be the case that greedy people are more easily bored than non-greedy people, which might be true. I don't know. But again, the combination of not being satisfied with earning too much chocolates and having to give it back, but then showing the same behavior when they come back to the lab 3 weeks later, indicates, I think, I hope, that it's also it's not only boredom, but it's also they're chasing something that they actually might not want. And I think that is something that I didn't talk about it, but that is also still high on my list, is to examine. We know that people have like two systems, one for wanting and one for liking. And the wanting is much more, I think, related to dopamine. And I think greed is very much a wanting thing, but not so much a liking thing. So greedy people chase stuff, but it doesn't mean that they actually like it when they get it.
Well, here's another question related to that study. I also wonder if gluttony versus greed may have played a role in that experiment.
Yeah, yeah, that could be, but then it would be projected gluttony because the people didn't really eat that much more. So there was, I think, we've done a few studies, and I think in one study we found a small relation that greedy people ate a little bit more than non-greedy people, but still the greedy people over-earned so much more than the non-greedy people that you cannot explain these findings in terms of gluttony. What is interesting, I think, is that if you talk about gluttony and greed, you might think about the seven deadly sins. And greed has also been referred to as the mother of all sins, as in all the other sins are a sort of particular form of being greedy. I don't know if that is the case, but it resonates a little bit with how we think about the construct.
So, do you believe that gluttony is a form of greed?
It can be. I think it can be. Yeah. I think that, if gluttony, if it's about limitless eating and eating too much, I think what you also sometimes hear is that people who eat so much also do it because not necessarily they don't like it when they do it, but they just want to eat more. So in that sense, there are clear links to greediness.
But it's not fair because greed is cerebral, and gluttony could be hormonal or physiological.
Yeah, so I realize I'm now sort of more in your territory than in mine. So I don't really I have no expertise in like neuroscience or physiological things. I think that some of these things might be a combination of visceral and being cerebral. And
Okay.
if dopamine would be play a role in greed, it's much more than only a desire.
Well, let's stick with the personality attribute here. Here's a question: what is the correlation between greed and narcissism?
I don't know if I actually so I'm now checking the book that Terry Sanchez wrote for her dissertation, if we have data on that. I don't know.
There might be a relationship, but I'm not sure how validated it is.
Yeah, so we don't have it in our data. I know there is research on like the dark traits. I'm not sure if narcissism is considered to be part of it, but greed is correlated to other sort of negative traits like um, what is it, Machiavellism and psychopathology and stuff like that. But I don't know work about narcissism.
Let's go back to your psychology background with the next question: how is greed treated?
Yeah, so I'm very much an academic in the sense that I study things, but I don't solve problems. So and I don't know if there's anything. So for it to be treated, it needs to be like pathological. And I think that the greed that we have been studying mostly, I think if you would score like extreme on the scale, it might be pathological, but we're also interested in sort of the more how do you say, more mundane expressions of greediness. So that is a long answer to the question where I should have said I have no idea.
But I will add to that there are no treatments for personality disorders in general. It's one of the biggest challenges in psychiatry. So a lot of psychotherapy is required, maybe teaching them better skills, giving them more insight. But I think, like narcissism and other personality disorders are ingrained in our brain. They're etched in our software, our mind software. It's very hard to change. But I've seen some changes in some people that were encouraging. Yeah, especially when they get religious, and their religious conversion can really change a very pathological person to a very gentle, meek, and nice person. I've seen it, but that's not a form of therapy we use. Let's next
Not
one.
anymore. No.
Where is the research overlap with greed as a trait of psychopathy? For example, white collar crime, also known as snakes in suits.
Yeah. So let me first repeat, there is not that much research on greed yet. So we started, there was hardly anything there. There's more and more coming now. So there's clear indications that greed is related to all sorts of immoral behaviors, also to some sorts of white collar crime. I think that would be a way where greed can really sort of manifest itself. There is some work about organizational researchers that basically argue that all the white collar crime is motivated by greed, but that's a conceptual piece, so we don't know about empirical research. But that all sorts of immoral behaviors and crime can be fueled by greed, I think is yeah, that's clear.
Here's another comment. Is greed a substitute for deep intimacy?
Can you help me understand that question?
Is greed a substitute for deep intimacy? I don't I know
No.
what that. Carl has
I'll comment since I wrote it. I mean, I wonder if greed isn't a substitute for emotional closeness and intimacy of people who have trouble with intimacy, real relationships, deep relationships. If greed becomes a way of pursuing that indirectly, kind of a
That's
substitute, a way of filling oneself up, whether
yeah,
it's
that's a,
food or materials or whatever, or fame or whatever,
there
it's a
is there,
substitute for true relationship.
yeah, so there is research also in social psychology about symbolic self-completion. So how people buy stuff to sort of complete elements of themselves that they are missing. So I see I now understand your question. I think it's a very interesting way to study. What is It's not an answer, but it might be related to it. There have been a few studies about whether where sort of greed is coming from, because that is also one of the things that we're interested in. And one of the things that people have been looking at is, do you become more greedy when you grow up poor or when you grow up rich? And the first two studies that were done, both of them actually not published, but could be found online. One study suggests that growing up poor makes you greedier, and the other one suggests that growing up rich makes you greedier. And then there were some researchers in China that thought, well, let's find it out with a big group of adolescents, and they found support for growing up rich makes you greedier than if you grow up poor. And they also found that it was also related to not having siblings. And I read that research and I thought it was really interesting. But what was complex with it is that in China, of course, is the only country that had like a one child policy for many years. So if you want to study the effects of siblings, I don't think China is the best country for doing it. And another thing is, it's a country with a long history of communism. And if you're interested in growing up rich and poor, it might also not be the best country for studying that. So what we did is we replicated that research with a sample from the US and a sample from the Netherlands. And we also found support for the idea that growing up rich is associated with being a little bit greedier later in life. Now,
I
it could
wonder if
be,
the key variable isn't attachment in some way, almost in Bowlby's sense of
yes,
attachment.
yeah, that could very well be the case. We don't know that. We have not studied that, but I think that might be that might be going on, but also might be going on, and we don't know it yet. So this is really something we have to study. But it could also be the case. It could be simpler that greedy people tend to be richer and tend to have greedy children. This research is all correlational, but I think the attachment side is really something that I think would be really interesting if that would be studied. Thank you.
Marcel, do you think that the opposite of greed is generosity or philanthropy?
I don't really know if there is an opposite to greed. So that is uh, in our scale. We don't have also we also don't have reverse coded items, because when we were thinking about what is it, it's if we see greed mainly as acquisitiveness, so wanting to have more of it, then maybe the opposite is being mindful that you're happy with what you have and that you don't desire much anymore.
Okay.
Um,
Let's go to the next question.
yes.
Have you looked at this construct through the lens of racial or religious stereotypes?
No, we have not. So most of the research that I talked about is also most of the research that we have done. What we did find in this big sample in the Netherlands is that a small relationship that the more religious people were or said they were, the less greedy they also said that they were. So, and the question is then, this could be a real correlation. It could also be something that people have learned that they shouldn't express their greediness, because it's in all world religions, greed is being frowned upon.
Well, let me ask you about this issue of greed from an ethology point of view. Isn't there some kind of benefit to being greedy because it can ensure the survival of oneself and one's progeny?
Yeah, That is, I think, one of the reasons why biologists argue that self-interest is good, and that the same reasoning would apply to greed. I think that might be the case. I also think if you look at squirrels, collecting nuts and burying them under the ground everywhere, not knowing where they are, but the more they bury, the more they have to eat in the winter, then it clearly makes sense. But what we find is, so behavior like that, of course, within humans you don't find anymore. What we do find is that it doesn't make you happy. Greedier people are just not happy. They might work a little bit harder, but they also have less friends and they're just less happy with life. And I'm not sure if being greedy nowadays still has survival benefits in the Western world.
I don't think ethology cares about being happy. It just cares
No, exactly.
the DNA
Yeah.
perpetuation and
Yeah.
procreation, so on and so forth.
In that sense, the fact that greedy people have more sex might be associated with it, but they have less. They indicated they say they have less children. So in that sense, we don't find evidence for that.
All right, let's go to a couple more questions here. As a personality disorder, does greed overlap with borderline pathology in treating others as objects in order to meet their needs?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in pathology. I typically study like ordinary people, but you do see that those patterns are part of greed are also part of these disorders. So I can imagine that if you're that some of these things overlap, but I really lack the expertise to say something smart about that.
Okay, great. Well, we're out of questions in the chat box. Are there any questions from the audience who want to speak up verbally? Just unmute yourself and speak up. And if we don't hear anything soon, we'll assume that we can wrap this up. Okay. So I don't see any typed questions, nor do I hear anybody speaking up. So let me conclude by thanking you, Professor Zeelenberg, for a very interesting lecture about greed, which is not often discussed actually in medical settings, but certainly it's an important psychological attribute in humans that has multiple repercussions, as you said, on the individual and on society as well. So it's a very important concept. Thank you again for joining us at 7 o'clock your time in the Netherlands, and we're delighted to have you. Hope to talk again in the future. Best wishes.
Yes. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening to me, and good luck with this program.
Thank you. And to the audience, I just want to remind you to send in your evaluations to Marcy as soon as you can. And also to remind you, this is the last grand rounds of the year of the academic cycle. We will see you next after a summer hiatus on September 11. That will be our next grand rounds. And so best wishes. Have a great summer, and hope to see you then. Bye-bye.